So, comics are gay. And you're gay for liking them. Hello, Swolemates. Welcome back. Dog bless you, and relax. It was a joke. Unless you actually are gay, in which case, carry on doing whatever you were doing. Live your dreams. Last week, we had a conversation about the straights, and this week we are going to be doing something similar, because yay, the straights! I love you guys, but this time you're in the hot seat. Remember those listening opportunities we talked about? This is one of them. Also, I am very sorry for how loud my jacket is. You like that? I don't. It's going to really bother me. Some of you who have been here a little longer might recognize this piece, so if it seems really familiar, no, it doesn't. This is a completely new and original work, just like that gaslighting joke I told at the beginning of this video. Jokes aside, yes, this is a secondary release, because the first time I attempted I was young and inexperienced and neglecting my shoulder rehab, so when the video got claimed for footage that was definitely fair use, I didn't really know what to do. But now I do, and I think this one deserves more eyes, so we're going to use our imaginations to travel back in time to spring of 2022. Chip Zdarsky had just pissed off a bunch of straight boys by committing the serious crime of having a fictional man make sultry eyes at another fictional man. And Kevin Conroy was still with us, at least for 6 more months. I try not to let my parasociality run wild, but that one hit hard, for reasons that will soon come to light. I need those of you who felt defensive when you saw the title of this one to know that it runs a lot deeper than you think. That's certainly true for me and countless other comic book fans out there. I need you to understand that this essay was written by a diehard fanboy who grew up loving these characters and seeing himself in them the same way you did. Someone who really loves the DC universe. And who may have also been a sequential arts student and former comic shop manager who knows way too much about comic book history, but hey, some of you could use a history lesson. Because superhero comics are a fascinating insight into recent human history, particularly in matters of identity. After all, there is a lot to be explored in the topic of leading a doubled life, and of having a secret about yourself that can't be shared outside of specific, trusted circles. There is an inherent queerness to superheroes, and this is particularly true of Batman, so let's get into it. Because outrage over the implication of Batman's non-heterosexuality is, like this video, older than you think. Gay readings of Batman are documented all the way back to 1954, when German-American psychiatrist Frederick Wertham did to comics what psychiatrists of the era did best. That is, apply an aggressively sexual filter that no one asked for. Wertham was the mind behind the infamous Seduction of the Innocent, a publication that argued comic books were responsible for juvenile delinquency and other such undesirable behaviors. You know, like homosexuality and deviating from gender norms. Such things were, at the time, still considered mental disorders as outlined in the DSM. Now, Wertham did exercise a rather broad focus on comics, and was particularly critical of gore and violence common in horror titles, as well as general portrayals of sexuality, but we're going to focus on his contempt for DC superheroes. There was no member of the DCU trinity that was safe from Wertham's criticism. In his mind, Superman was a fascist symbol, and Wonder Woman was a lesbian awash in bondage subtext. I mean, he wasn't necessarily wrong on that front. Wonder Woman's creator, William Moulton Marston, owned the bondage theme pretty openly. As for Wonder Woman's sexuality, Wertham argued that her power and independence were hallmarks of lesbianism. Honestly, if his big gripe was about Diana's attraction to women, it was the right conclusion from the wrong place. Since about 2011, Wonder Woman's bisexuality has been pretty much solidified, which honestly kind of felt like a given. I mean, she's lived for thousands of years on an island populated entirely by women and clearly experiences attraction, so between that and her relationship with Steve Trevor, Diana is about as bi/pan as they come. But that's a story for another day. Let's get back to Batman. Perhaps most famously, Wertham fervently argued that Batman embodied explicitly gay themes. In his view, this messaging not only had a direct impact on young readers of the comic, but should have been patently clear to anyone of academic leanings.
Several years ago, a California psychiatrist pointed out that Batman stories are psychologically homosexual. Our researchers confirm this entirely. Only someone ignorant of the fundamentals of psychiatry and the psychopathology of sex can fail to realize the subtle atmosphere of homoeroticism which pervades the adventures of the mature Batman and his young friend Robin.
He honed in a fair amount on the imagery, particularly Robin's bare legs and tendency to be posed crotch forward. Now, that's his observation, not mine, though he would probably be rolling in his grave over where our boy Grayson has gotten to since his innocent origins. What seemed to stand out to Wertham as even more offensive, however, was the obvious affection shared by the dynamic duo.
As they sit by their fireplace, the young boy sometimes worries about his partner. Something's wrong with Bruce. He hasn't been himself these past 2 days. It is like a wish dream of two homosexuals living together.
It's this point in the book that Wortham ventures into his interviews with gay youth who were, at the time, being treated for their homosexuality. Questioned directly on the topic of Batman, one of said patients mused pleasantly about an image of the shared manor house, quote, beautifully landscaped, warmly lighted, and showing the devoted pair side by side looking out a picture window. The same subject went on to expound on things I'd rather not get demonetized over, but his contribution ends specifically with stating how he would place himself in the rescued role when he was reading these stories. How he often fantasized about what it would feel like to be loved by someone like Batman or Superman. According to Wortham, another great violation in the Batman comics was the degradation of gender roles, feeding this inclination towards softness in some male readers being one example. Robin was often placed in perilous situations that required him to be rescued, a docile role typically reserved for women. Where the ladies of the Batman universe were concerned, their deviation from expected behaviors was also deemed part of the problem. Primarily, they were too badass.
A typical female character is the Catwoman, who's vicious and uses a whip. The atmosphere is homosexual and anti-feminine. If the girl is good-looking, she's undoubtedly the villainess.
Selina Kyle, girl boss for 82 years and counting. Apparently this fictional woman has single-handedly turned countless unsuspecting children gay by not doing femininity right or something. I don't know, I just work here. Now, am I using seduction of the innocent of all things to argue that Batman is inherently gay? No. Personally, I'm deeply uncomfortable with Wortham's reading because Dick was a child and Bruce was intended more as a father figure. The primary reason Robin was added to the comics was to give Batman someone to talk to so that the panels weren't all thought bubbles and narration. Robin being a boy was intended as a way for the target demographic to be able to relate to Batman. Some of said target demographic just so happened to be gay. What I'm trying to illustrate here is that Batman comics have always had a gay and gender non-conforming following who saw themselves in the stories. And this goes all the way back to when these people were under threat of being institutionalized for even having those thoughts and feelings. The very fact that Batman, so early in his inception, was criticized for apparent portrayals of homosexuality was in itself something gay audiences could identify with. After all, they too were policed and criticized on those grounds. So defensiveness over the history of the character where gay readings are concerned have always confused me by virtue of not factoring in the history of the character. It's all well and good to say Batman was written as heterosexual when handled predominantly by heterosexual writers throughout time periods where homosexuality was actively censored. I am speaking, of course, of the Comics Code Authority, born out of Wortham's fearmongering in 1954. If you're not explicitly familiar with the CCA but have ever glanced at a comic book before, you've definitely seen it. It was an independent screening system that provided a stamp of approval indicating publishers had done their due diligence in censoring immoral or offensive content. Such content, just so we're clear, included excessive gore, naughty words, and sexual themes. It also screened for any content including public authorities, such as politicians and police officers, that portrayed them, quote, in such a way as to create disrespect for established authority. If this feels hilariously ironic when applied to countless titles about vigilantes taking the law into their own hands, it's because it is. Needless to say, given that gay and trans people were considered moral degenerates during the CCA's inception, even the slightest hint of our existence could be grounds for censorship. Let's just keep in mind that this is from the same organization that approved a story about the gruesome murder of a child and a cover image depicting his demise in a narrative with a terrorism subplot. Apparently that was permissible, yet it took another 5 years for us to see a gay kiss in mainstream comics with the publication of Enigma in 1993. Contrary to popular belief, the medal for the first explicit mainstream comic gayness portrayal does, in fact, go to DC Comics. Although even then, it was published under Vertigo, their darker, more adult-oriented branch, absent CCA approval. Now, I could go on about the Comics Code and its degradation over time, but we'd be here all day. Just keep in mind that up until 2001 when Marvel ditched it and 2011 when DC finally followed suit, this was basically the standard. That is, any depictions of queerness were actively censored until at least the 2000s, so if you're a heterosexual comic fan who feels like you've been suddenly inundated with queer characters, it's because we have a whole lot of catching up to do thanks to about 50 years of literally not being allowed to show them. Creators who were formerly censored have a little bit more creative freedom when it comes to writing themselves and their audiences into these stories, or generally just portraying characters that are different from what we're used to seeing. But to summarize the point here, these characters aren't being made queer. We're simply seeing where their stories and personalities can go without looming censorship, and I want you to take a moment to ask yourself why this might resonate so much with queer audiences. Like it or not, Comics, particularly the Batman comics, are inextricably linked with queer history and our ongoing timeline of liberation. But you didn't just come here for a history lesson. You came here to be delighted or pissed off by my interpretation of Batman canon, and who am I to disappoint? So I'm about to blow your mind with a pretty important fact that frequently gets left out of this conversation, which is that Batman isn't real. I know that's a lot to take in. I was pretty bummed when I first found out about it as well, but Batman is, in fact, a fictional character, and therefore, subject to whatever interpretation each writer would like to apply to him. If we're looking specifically at performative behavior, then yes, Batman is most often written as heterosexual, or at least in heterosexual appearing relationships. That being said, if you were looking for a queer man circa 1939 who wasn't also heterosexual outside of very specific, very secretive circles, you would be looking for a long-ass time. Because, you know, it was illegal to be queer. And I'm not just being cute, that literally it was illegal. But this doesn't touch on the psychology of the character, which is also readily available in canon. And so taking that approach, where does the evidence lead us? Batman is asexual. At the most basic level, it makes the most sense to assume that a character is asexual unless stated otherwise. It's kind of weird to just assign attraction patterns to somebody else, but for Batman, there's even more that indicates this. It doesn't take extensive examination to see that Bruce Wayne is generally pretty disinterested in sexual encounters. Not repulsed, he'll go there, but it's pretty much always in response to another character initiating. It's also made abundantly clear that the billionaire playboy performance is just that, a performance. Rather than being drawn to sex, or women in an explicitly sexual manner, Bruce prioritizes other aspects of his life, making exceptions only when he connects with someone on some other level. Bruce Wayne is also famously one of the few human characters who shows at least some level of resistance to Poison Ivy's powers in many instances. Some creators and fans will argue that this is his superhuman willpower, but worth consideration is the fact that physical attraction ain't really a thing that affects the guy, giving him a leg up against foes like Ivy. I personally feel that Robert Pattinson encapsulated this aspect of Bruce's character brilliantly in The Batman. Catwoman, as a character, exudes sexuality, and Zoe Kravitz's depiction did not fall short on that front, while also exemplifying the tenacity, fearlessness, and talent Selina Kyle brings to the fore. Her attraction toward Batman was incredibly clear, but was it reciprocated? Not really. At least not until they develop a deeper connection, at which point we see Bruce follow through on romantic feelings, but not necessarily sexual ones. In fact, we're even given a scene where he quite literally watches Selina undress, and the inappropriate angle of this doesn't even cross his mind. I'd argue it's because that inclination isn't even present. He's looking for information, not gratification. More recently, in the issue that reignited this entire discourse, Chip Zdarsky and Carmine Di Giandomenico show Bruce in a blatantly homoerotic exchange. As it turns out, Bruce was using seduction to gather information, which, of course, many heterosexual fans interpreted as confirmation of Batman's straightness. What I took from this, and I know I'm not alone here, is just affirmation of Batman's asexuality and the fact that sexual attraction is simply a performance in his repertoire. One thing that all Batman fans of all orientations can agree on is that in the dichotomy of Bruce Wayne and Batman, the real person is the Bat. And if you've missed that guy's general disinterest in sex, I don't know what to tell you. He doesn't really hide it. So his ability to perform attraction toward women and men with the same convincing proficiency is more in line with biromantic asexuality than it is with heterosexuality. But let's step aside from Bruce Wayne's patterns both in and out of the cowl and go back to that whole he's not a real person thing. Batman is an archetype, an outlet for the inclinations of those writing and a point of connection for those reading. That's kinda the whole point of art and how we see ourselves in it. Straight fans can connect to Batman's relationships with women. Asexual fans can connect with his lack of attraction and the fact that said relationships are often performative. And gay fans can connect with the fact that an embodiment of the masculine power fantasy performs heterosexuality by day and dons fetishistic leather gear to spend his nights in the company of an acrobatic twink. I'm sorry, straight friends, you don't get a monopoly on interpretation just because Batman's longest running love interest, who is canonically bi while we're on it, happens to be a woman. There are 1,000,001 different ways to be queer, and Batman ticks a great many boxes that would qualify him. We already talked about the running theme of him seeing women just to keep up appearances, which lends itself to gay or asexual readings more readily than it does heterosexual ones, but let's go through some others. Batman draws the obsessive fixation of a great many openly queer or queer-coded villains. His entire narrative is one of duality, playing the role expected of him in the public eye and living his truth underground. He's surrounded by found family with whom he can share his true self, expressed via campy outfits because of course. This found family is built from a place of empathy for those who share the experience of being lost, alone, or just plain weird by conventional standards. Bruce is also pretty much always in some kind of a co-parenting arrangement with other men, specifically Alfred and Superman. In Nightwing Year 1, when a fight between the dynamic duo finally leads to Dick giving up the mantle of Robin, who does he go to for support? None other than Clark Kent. The pair sit down for a heart-to-heart that leads to Dick naming his new masked persona after the Kryptonian hero, Nightwing. That is, he chooses a new name in honor of a father figure who offers patience and guidance to counteract Bruce's stern discipline and unrealistic standards. This is hugely important in Grayson's development not only as a superhero, but from boyhood to manhood. Now, I could go on. We could do an entire analysis of the homosexual undertones of just the Lego Batman movie if we wanted to, but there's a much more important point here that I'd like to get to. Now, we can talk canonical themes all day long, but they're only half of the case for the inherent queerness of Batman, because all this goes beyond mere themes open to interpretation and gets a lot more real, especially when we consider the many queer creators who have written, directed, and portrayed The Dark Knight. Let's start with non-binary comic book legend Grant Morrison, who wrote a number of Batman titles between 2006 and 2013. My personal opinion is that their Dick Grayson Batman stories are the best ones. Having the jovial Grayson and brooding Wayne dynamic back but with the mantles swapped is just so much fun. Morrison has some pretty interesting thoughts on this as someone who has written the character extensively. In a 2012 interview with Playboy, they extrapolated specifically on the gay themes rampant in the title.
Gayness is built into Batman. I'm not using gay in the pejorative sense, but Batman is very, very gay. There's just no denying it. Obviously, as a fictional character, he's intended to be heterosexual, but the basis of the whole concept is utterly gay. I think that's why people like it. All these women fancy him and they all wear fetish clothes and jump around rooftops to get to him. He doesn't care. He's more interested in hanging out with the old guy and the kid.
Now, Playboy took this quote and reduced it to a soundbite of Morrison declaring Batman's gayness and called it at that. A lot of people were pissed, and it wasn't until a follow-up interview with the New Statesman that Morrison was really given the opportunity to clarify, and in doing so, arguably just made a case for the character's asexuality.
You can easily dial up the black leather fetishistic night-dwelling aspects of Batman and the masculinity of Batman and get a pretty good gay Batman. But as I said, ultimately he's not gay because he has no sex life really. All he is an adventurer. Sometimes they show him with girls, sometimes he never seems to be going out with girls.
Of course, the fact that they had to revisit the topic and clarify in the first place speaks volumes. Apparently a writer can't even muse about a character's sexuality being anything but straight without facing backlash. Which is part of the problem, because these themes have always been there and continue to be there, openly enjoyed by straight and queer fans alike. I mean, are we not going to talk about the camp of the Silver Age? Hell, are we not going to talk about Joel Schumacher? Honestly, I don't think we really have to. His work speaks for itself. But that's the problem, isn't it? Rampant queerness in the Batman universe is all well and good until it's specifically stated that that's what it is. Expecting a character to be ill-defined enough to make it past the remnants of Christian censorship and the delicate sensibilities of straight fans in order to succeed would be a mere annoyance if it existed in a vacuum. But it doesn't. It bleeds out, and it reflects the very real experiences of a great many people, one in particular who has had a profound impact on the Dark Knight as we have come to know and love him. I am talking, of course, about Kevin Conroy. Conroy is the voice of Batman. If you consumed any Batman or Justice League cartoons or video games, you already know that. September 5th of this year actually marks the 30th anniversary of Conroy's debut as the Caped Crusader, and there's more yet to come. He has carried the Batman mantle longer than any other actor or writer and reached a huge audience in the process. He's also a gay man, and only in the past 6 years or so has he expressed this fact openly on his platform. His reason for separating this aspect of his identity from his work throughout the 80s and 90s shouldn't be challenging to figure out. Most queer people can tell you about our experiences having to hide who we are, about wearing a mask. Dare I even say, leading a double life that necessitates separation between the permissible person we present by day and the reality that emerges when the sun goes down. Conroy has spoken openly about his struggles as a gay man trying to make his way in Hollywood, the harassment and rejection he faced, the funerals he attended for friends lost to the AIDS crisis, and how all of this impacted him. His willingness to share this with the world is why I felt comfortable talking about it here. In all honesty, it's why I feel comfortable talking about this entire topic as a bisexual man and DC Comics fan. I encourage you to go ahead and read Kevin Conroy's piece in this year's DC Pride collection. It would be a disservice for me to summarize his story here. And hey, if you've stubbornly been refusing to buy anything with a rainbow on it all your life, maybe now is a good time to challenge yourself and break that streak. Do it for Batman. Instead, what I'd like to do here is share something very special and deeply personal that offered me a glimpse into Conroy's story and how it shaped his understanding of Batman. And it happened at a time when I was really in need of that connection.
Hey, Finn. This is Batman, calling you from Wayne Manor. I wanted to wish you a very, very happy holiday. And Jackie thinks the world of you. It's great to have friends like that. She told me you just came out and how proud she is of you. You should be proud of yourself. That takes a lot of courage to just admit who you are to the world. That's a big part of the Batman story, I think, is he has these two identities. I have always thought the real identity was Batman. That's who he is. That's who he became after he watched his parents get murdered. But he's incapable of sharing that identity with the world. So he creates this social artifice of Bruce Wayne to be acceptable. But that's not who he really is. He really is Batman. And he only lets people in who he feels he trusts. And that's part of the flaw of Bruce Wayne. Bruce Wayne is a very flawed man. It's why people love him so much, I think. Of all the superheroes, he's the one who has no superpowers. His superpower is his humanity, is his passion to heal the world using just his strength, his will to do good, to do the right thing. So he fights evil. And that's what people love about the character, I think, so much, is that he is so human. He is so flawed. We are all flawed. So my hat's off to you for being able to be honest about who you are. Because, you know, you only get one ticket in life, and you don't want to waste any of the time playing games for other people. It's your life, and you're grabbing it like you should. That's great. So, I'm in your corner, Finn. Batman's got your back.
What you just saw was a gift from one of my best friends, Jackie. She sent that to me the first holiday after I came out of the closet and started my transition. And I bawled my eyes out because of course I did. I am trying very hard to hold it together right now because it hits even harder now that he's gone. Hearing those words from that man is more meaningful to me than I can adequately communicate. He spoke directly to struggles that I experienced as a kid, as a teenager, as an adult who was living a life that didn't really feel like mine, who had to confront a lot of things in order to claim myself and my identity, in order to be real. And he did so through a universe that I would escape into when those struggles became too much for me to deal with. He didn't only speak with empathy, but with personal understanding from having struggled with that very same experience himself. The duality of superheroes is something that most queer people can really understand on a much deeper level than I think other people realize. I think many of us find an escape in comic books for many different reasons, and none of them are wrong or right. But what is wrong is telling another fan that their interpretation of a character is incorrect, offensive, or shameful. What is wrong is trying to police the way other people engage with art, especially when they find freedom and a sense of normalcy in doing so. Where Batman is concerned, it's not just other fans you cast aside in doing this, but the queer creators who use their experiences to bring that character to life. People who have tapped into the pain and duality inevitable in so many of our stories and turned it into something that you can connect with. The problem is not how we connect, but that so many straight fans can't seem to do it in the absence of declared heterosexuality. That your ability to relate to a character is suddenly compromised the moment you find out they're queer or read as such. Queer people have, since the inception of comics, found ways to see ourselves in characters that differ from us drastically, whether it's gender, sexuality, or both. So why can't you do the same? I want to kick off the closing with some insight from Will Brooker. Brooker is a professor at Kingston University who specializes in film, fandoms, and cultural studies with particular focus on Batman. In 2001, he published Batman Unmasked, analyzing a cultural icon. So if you're curious to read his work, you should check it out. He has also summarized this whole topic very nicely in a 2012 article about this very subject.
Batman, after 73 years of publication, with appearances on TV, in video games, movies, and comics, can never be tied down to any one identity. Batman has been a ridiculous Boy Scout, a fearsome vigilante, a protective father, a loner, a clown. Batman is a myth and a mosaic, an icon who catches the light at different angles at different times, and takes multiple forms. But gayness, from high camp to intense homoeroticism, is an important aspect of that icon.
If this quote bothered you, you're probably already looking for ways to discredit Brooker's expertise. Like, sure, he's studied Batman extensively, and he may have a PhD backing his ability to analyze pop culture, but how can anyone be an expert in a fictional character? How indeed. Might I suggest turning that indignation inward to ask why so many of you have apparently granted yourselves this exact authority, and specifically to gatekeep. Brooker is using his analysis to open up the conversation and welcome people in, but a lot of you are really keen on closing this off and excluding anyone who's not like you. I don't understand how any superhero fan, someone who claims to love a universe that is built around celebrating the underdog, could do that. And while we're looking inward, maybe you could ask yourself why it would so undermine your love of Batman for him to be anything other than cisgender and straight. Is his ability to say no to women he is otherwise attracted to really that important to the vicarious male power fantasy? That he has these beautiful women throwing themselves at him, yet he maintains disinterest? There is a whole lot of masculine fragility wrapped up in that particular detail, and I think a lot of you could benefit from asking why it's so important to you. But I think it goes a lot deeper than that for many people. It's easy to feel defensive of these characters that we love. After all, they tend to serve as reliable constants in our lives, not to mention mementos for some of our most precious years and experiences. I've already mentioned how the Batman universe was an escape for me, but being in the closet isn't the only reason someone might need an imaginary world to run to. Everything from simply enjoying a comic book adventure to experiencing trauma can tether us to such a place. And the more time we spend there, the more we see ourselves in these characters, the more they embody pieces of who we are. You have likely linked Batman to your identity in some way. Maybe it's to your childhood, maybe it's to your masculinity, maybe it's to your sense of isolation and loneliness. But regardless, when somebody else shares their interpretation, their feelings toward this character, they're not just talking about Batman, are they? They're talking about you. I saw a comment forever ago, from back when I initially wrote this essay, from a guy who said, "I'm not homophobic, but," and then went on to explain that Batman being anything other than straight would make him, and I quote, uncomfortable. And credit where it's due, good for that guy. A lot of people don't even get that far where they recognize that it's about their discomfort. But the ones who do tend to just leave it there. I'm uncomfortable, full stop. But it doesn't stop there. There's some more exploring, some more work you gotta do. You gotta ask yourself why. Why does Batman need to be straight for you to continue to enjoy him? Why would him expressing attraction to other men ruin the character? The obvious problem here is that you don't have a greater claim to Batman or any other character than the rest of us. Most of us include our favorite characters in our stories of ourselves. But if your story requires that other people concede their own interpretations, their own lives, their own connections to these characters in order for it to hold true, who is really forcing their read on others? And if you're perfectly fine with that, then let's push a little further. How do you feel knowing that one of the most iconic voices to ever lend itself to the Dark Knight was from a man who nearly didn't get the opportunity, specifically because of people like you? Conroy touches on this in his 2022 DC Pride retelling of his story, the way he faced harassment and lost acting jobs just for being gay. It certainly paints a vivid picture as to why he didn't come out publicly until 2016. That's 26 years of bringing light into other people's lives while compromising his own. And why? Because it makes some of you uncomfortable. If you are bothered by a queer reading of Batman, it likely comes down to one or more of a few different options that I will summarize here. The first is that you've tied heterosexuality to the very concept of manhood to the point that it is a necessary component in the masculine power fantasy. Honestly, a dose of Midnighter would probably clear that entanglement right up, but barring that, it might be worth asking yourself this. Is it a marker of secure masculinity to be threatened by the hypothetical gayness of an imaginary man? Isn't that, just a little silly? Unless, of course, the issue is more of an option 2, which is that you are threatened by the idea that some aspect of your identity isn't quite as straight as you thought. After all, unless you're a billionaire vigilante orphan who kicks it with demigods and aliens, you've accepted a whole slew of differences between yourself and Bruce Wayne, but can still connect with him. So why would that detail be any different unless it hits a little too close to home for your comfort? And finally, there's the possibility that you simply don't see queer people as human beings that you can share commonalities with. People who deserve your respect. People you could look up to and admire. People you could consider heroes. It's not enough to just say that you're not homophobic and then continue to harbor this discomfort with our very existence. Homophobia isn't always just being the aggressor. It's often a lot more subtle than that. And unpacking it typically involves confronting a lot of feelings that tend to hide behind statements like, it's just about canonical accuracy. Given that this conversation has taken a turn toward analyzing our own connections to Bruce Wayne and how we see ourselves in the character, maybe his tendency to wallow and avoid processing hard feelings isn't the best thing to emulate. I can't be the person who says why so many of you have chosen to prioritize that over his perseverance, his problem solving, his desire to do good. But I don't think it takes the world's greatest detective to figure it out. Rather, just a little bit of time and willingness to examine your feelings. By honing that ability, you actually have the opportunity to be better than Batman. The idea that queer representation in geekdom is pandering has always been really funny to me. I mean, I'm not about to deny that a lot of studios do go for the hollow representation points. We know rainbow capitalism is a thing. But this argument just completely neglects decades of censorship that specifically forced every single creator to only ever show cis heteronormativity. Just unabashed, full-blown censorship. Not just pandering, but pandering under threat. The shift toward more queer representation in comic books is because creators are no longer forced to censor themselves, to compromise themselves, to adhere only to cis heteronormativity. And if you are a cisgender straight person who is threatened by that, you need to exercise some humility, because we're not out here making everyone queer. You're out here assuming everybody is straight by default, often while vilifying and ostracizing anyone who's not like you to the point that many live in fear of being themselves. The rainbow people are not some nebulous marketing entity. They are people you know. They're me. They're many of the creators who bring these characters to you so that you can enjoy them in the first place. And we've always been here. We've always seen ourselves in these characters. We've always been represented by our own in whatever little ways, little signals they could send to us, working us into the stories to give us a sense of normalcy and tell us that we have a place in this world. That the people who are not ready for our truth simply fear the power that we have to reshape the world by sharing it. But we can talk about that another day. The beauty of fiction is that everyone gets to see themselves within it. These characters can be whatever you need them to be, and that's part of the real-world power that they hold. So before you leap to defend your interpretation of an imaginary character, try to remember the real human beings you're speaking to. As much as many of us enjoy the vicarious thrill of a favorite character's double identity, hiding our true selves is not the romanticized experience we see in stories. Part of what made Kevin Conroy so convincing, so right for the role of Batman, was his lived experience with that pain, with having to hide a part of himself, having to live two separate lives. I am glad that he got to openly be his entire self before he died. But I am deeply saddened by the fact that the attitudes that kept him and so many others hidden behind masks for so long continue to this day. Many of us who have lived that before are doing what we can to change it, but we need your cooperation. We need you to prioritize other people's humanity over your comfort, to confront those feelings. If someone else seeing themselves in art that you identify with is threatening to you, it is not because that person is infringing on something that they are not equally as entitled to. It is because your sense of self is too weak to exist without outside validation, and that is what should offend you. But the good news is that you can change. I am going to leave it there. Please be kind to each other, remember that art is meant to be shared, and thank you for watching. And thank you, Kevin, for being the hero we needed.